Hi, this is Amanda Greenvoss, and for my final project, I'm going to present a critical discourse analysis of Portland Police Bureau's officer-involved shooting data. I'll start by giving a brief overview of critical discourse analysis, then talk about why I chose police shootings, then I'll discuss open data and what it purports to do. After that, I'll walk you through the officer-involved shooting dashboard, analyze it and discuss my findings. Then I will analyze and discuss the narrative reports. And finally, I will talk about where I recommend that we go from here based on my analysis. Let's start by discussing the important aspects of critical discourse analysis. There are 6 main components. 1. Texts are not created in a vacuum. There is context both as the text is being created and as it is being read or consumed. 2. Attempts are made to unite the analysis of the text itself, the discursive practices that create and interpret the text, and the larger social context. 3. True CDA analyses focus on important societal issues, and the aims of the research having consequences that help the lives of people. 4. CDA researchers take an ethical stance and draw attention to power imbalances. It acknowledges that we do bring our own bias into our research. 5. Researchers in CDA assume a social constructionist view, which essentially means that there is no objective reality. Additionally, CDA tries to highlight situations where people in power intentionally construct and report a version of reality that favors their own interests. And 6. Because CDA is meant to dismantle power structures, it is also important to make the research as accessible as possible and to as many people as possible, using plain English and avoiding jargon. The issue I want to focus on today is police oversight, specifically the oversight of police shooting civilians. The Washington Post has been tracking shootings since 2015 and found that 1,000 people are shot by police per year. And this doesn't include people like George Floyd and Eric Garner, killed by police without the use of guns. Zooming into the local context of Portland, you probably know about the large nightly protests that started in 2020 in the wake of George Floyd's death. People in Portland, including myself, have fought for increased accountability of the police, or even to abolish the police altogether. I'm also a member of the Citizen Review Committee, where we attempt to create policies to hold the police more accountable, and we sit on panels to review the actions of police officers in use of force cases, including shootings. This is all made very difficult by a strong police union. In the majority of the few cases in which an officer is found at fault and punished, the findings are often overturned by the union. In 2017, the Metro Council passed an ordinance to create an open data program, giving unprecedented access to police records and information, including officer-involved shootings. Portland was one of the first bureaus to do this. In 2017, the National Policing Institute created a pamphlet to help police bureaus understand why they would want to publish their data. They state, police officers and community members alike are empowered to develop a fact-based perspective on community-police relations. This sounds great. A portal where community members can access the facts of the cases and understand the truth of each incident. In the Open Data Ordinance enacted in 2017, they defined data as factual, quantitative, or qualitative information. From my social constructionist viewpoint, I would argue that nothing is purely factual, and in the creation and consumption of these data, different versions of the truth are manufactured. And of course, the police have a strong motivation to present the facts in a way that upholds their credibility and maintains their power. Because open access to police data is relatively new, there has been little to no research done on the data itself and no analysis of how the information is presented. In order to fill this gap, I aim to investigate the following. Does Portland Police Bureau's officer-involved shooting database provide a fact-based access to information? For my data, I looked at the officer-involved shooting database dashboard, which summarizes the shooting incidents and provides statistics on certain criteria. Then I analyzed 6 narrative reports of specific shooting incidents from 2019. Each text was about 400 words long. I chose those 6 texts because they were the most recent available when I did the analysis. This is a small sample that allowed me to make a closer analysis of each text, but also large enough to notice some trends between the texts. For the dashboard, my methods involved first exploring the tool and using it as any member of the public might. I took notice of how things were reported and phrased, as well as what was missing from the data. I specifically sought out items which reinforced the power of the police and diminished the negative public relations effects of having shot someone. To analyze the narrative reports, I analyzed each transitive sentence involving the officer or the victim of the shooting. I counted active versus passive voice for each person. Then, for the officers, I sorted their actions into violent versus nonviolent actions. I additionally looked for other patterns that could influence a reader's perception of the events, as well as looking for what was omitted. Let's start by analyzing the dashboard. Here's a screenshot of the top of the officer-involved shooting dashboard. You can sort this data in many different ways. On first glance, it looks really good. It gives so much information about all of the police shootings. This feels like a great step for the police to make sure that the public can hold them accountable. However, there is some subtle work being done to manipulate how the data is perceived. The first thing I'd like to draw your attention to is the very name of the database, Officer-Involved Shootings. This phrasing does not make it clear that the officer was doing the shooting, or indeed that he shot and over half the time killed another person. We could rename the database People Shot and Killed by the Police, and it would be just as factual, but would not show the cops in as rosy of a light. Next, we find the term subject. The term is most often used in lab experiments, but in this case, it's a stand-in for a human being who was shot by the police. A word we could use instead would be victim. Again, just as factual, but not a good look for the police. Notice in the box on the bottom right, it says 52% of cases in which subjects' injuries were fatal. This tongue-twisting language prevents connecting the injuries with the action of the police and avoids using the word death. A shorter and clearer statistic might read, 52% of shooting victims died. Same facts with less obfuscation. If we scroll further down the dashboard, we get even more statistics. On the left, we can see the percentages of time that the police reportedly perceived the subject to be armed with a weapon. Below that is the percent of cases in which they turned out to actually be armed with a weapon. 83% of all cases. Now, let's look to the subject weapon types on the right. The second one down, which is the second most frequent weapon type listed, is a firearm replica. These do not include any actual weapon. If we click on it, a tooltip pops up to let us know that this includes BB guns, pellet guns, starter guns, other replica firearms, etc. They do not explicitly say, but I would have to assume that toy guns would also go in this category. None of these are actual life-threatening weapons. And now that I've clicked on it, it recalculates our percentages on the left to be only about replica firearms. The first statistic makes sense. In all cases where the subject had a replica firearm, they were perceived as having a weapon. But what about the stat below this? 100%. Are they counting all replica firearms as actual weapons? How was this decision made? And because it's the second most frequent weapon type, this increases that total stat of 83% for this category by a lot, which emphasizes the perception of danger that the officer was in and justifies his actions in his shooting. And what's left out? Well, it doesn't list the known mental health status of the victims, even though we know that people in mental health crises are more likely to be shot by police. We also don't know what the officer's previous records show. Have citizens complained about their actions before? Is there a pattern of abuse before these shooting incidents? We can't see the patterns if the data is not kept, aggregated, or published. Let's move on to the narrative reports. Here are screenshots of two of the reports I analyzed. First, take a look at the photographs. All the photos of the victims who were killed have a blank background, preventing us from seeing them as regular members of the public. These are not mugshots, but they have the same austere quality of a mugshot. No credits are given for the source of the photo. They also post pictures of any weapon found on the victim, whether it was used or not, again underscoring the feeling of danger. In these reports, the shooting victim is referred to as the suspect, which has the reader assume the victim is a felon or lawbreaker and criminalizes the deceased even though they're never charged for their crimes. In other naming convention, in each narrative, they refer to the officer at least once as a veteran, calling out their years of service. The term veteran is used for people with many years of experience in the field, connoting expertise and wisdom, but in this case, all cops are veterans. If we zoom in on the article to the right, we can see that Officer Jeffrey Livingston is a 1.5-year veteran. By giving all of the officers this title, it imbues them with a sense of experience and knowledge. It tells the reader that they knew what they were doing, and it perpetuates the power structure where the cops know more than the citizens. By analyzing all of the transitive verbs about the officers or suspects, I found the following. Officers were talked about in active voice twice as much as in passive voice, and I'll go into this more in detail in a couple of slides. But first, notice that the suspect is almost always depicted in active voice. Let's take a closer look at how that plays out. In the narrative reports, we see phrases like, "The male suspect ran from the crash. Suspect reportedly displayed an edged weapon. Kimmons fired 5 shots." These are all direct actions by the suspect conveying intention, movement, and danger. It portrays the suspect as an active threat that must be stopped. For the active and passive verbs about the officers, I wanted to uncover a little more about what was going on. So I sorted the transitive verbs into violent and nonviolent actions. As you can see from the table, almost all of the nonviolent actions were in the active voice, whereas the violent actions were almost evenly split between active and passive. I frankly expected more passive violent actions, but as I'll show you in a minute, both ways managed to avoid connecting the officers to the violent actions on the victim. But first, let's look at the nonviolent active voice actions. These sentences sound very straightforward and like a very typical reporting of events. Officers encountered the suspect and located the suspect, called for medical response, rendered medical aid at the scene. The officer requested emergency medical responders. All of these sentences portray our ideal of a good cop, finding the bad guy, and once the bad guy is injured, the officer does what he can to provide medical aid and save the victim, forgetting the fact that the need for medical aid is because of the officer. Now let's look at the passive-voiced violent actions of the officer, and we can see a different pattern. The suspect was injured by gunfire. Detectives have confirmed that less lethal and lethal rounds were fired. At some point during the search, officers encountered the suspect, and shots were fired. Now, if you read these out of context, there'd be no way to know who did the shootings. The officers are nowhere to be seen in the clauses, and it's only from knowing what the report is about that you have any idea who fired their weapon. This removes the police from the violent actions they committed. And even when the violent actions are in the active voice, they're not as straightforward as you might think. Detectives believe the officer deployed his taser. Officer Aaron Rizzo deployed less lethal force during the incident. Officer Gary Doran, a 12-year veteran, deployed deadly force. In all of these, the word deployed is used. This makes the use of a weapon into a technical procedure, again removing the violence of the act. And whereas the passive violent actions remove the officers as the actor, these sentences remove the object of the violent action. None of these sentences mention the victim who is at the other end of the weapon. Again, this sanitizes the truth of what happened. It separates the action from consequences, in this case, the murder of a human being. This theme of sanitization continues to the victim's death, which is never explicitly stated. A weapon is deployed, a suspect is injured by gunfire, and at some point the medical examiner pronounces the victim deceased. We never witness the moment of death because the police do not want us to mourn this loss of life. The final paragraph for the shooting death of Lane Martin says that the grand jury determined that the officers were justified in his use of deadly force shooting death of Lane Martin. This gives the reader a sense of justice. The actions of the officer were investigated and reviewed, and the officers were found justified. This implies that the opposite is also possible. If the shooting was not justified, the jury would convict the officer and he would be punished. But then you look at the next case and see the exact same wording. In fact, I was drawn to notice how similar they were because of the strange wording, "The officers were justified in his use of deadly force shooting death," and saw that the next one said the same, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And when you see them all in aggregate, it seems like a foregone conclusion that every case will end this way, regardless of the particulars. It is inevitable that the police will be found justified in their actions. What's being left out? Well, in all of these reports, we hear only the perspectives of the police officers themselves, who are motivated to cast themselves in a positive light and to cast the victim as a criminal who deserved what they got. We don't hear from any witnesses to the incident or family members of the victim. We get no details about who this person was, what they did for a living, whether they had family. Also, without a deep dive into each case, we can't know for sure how many details are being left out. Here is just one example. It's a quote from the police narrative. At 3:08 a.m., as Kimmons began running toward officers and other people who were in the area with his revolver, officers fired 12 rounds at him. What they don't tell you is that Kimmons turned and ran as soon as the cops started shooting, and the autopsy showed that 7 of the 9 bullets that hit him were from behind. He was running away, which means that the officers' lives were no longer in danger, and according to protocol, they should have stopped shooting. It is probable that all of the narratives have left out details that do not put the officers in a good light. None of the reports seem to be outright lies, but there is a lot of work done to obfuscate the truth through omission. The National Policing Institute encourages more police forces to create open data, stating that it increases public trust by demonstrating a commitment to accountability. I totally agree with this statement. It is demonstrating accountability, creating a public image of openness while distorting the statistics and details of the case in their favor. Additionally, they claim that open data can also inform or correct perceptions. Again, I totally agree. They are informing and correcting perceptions into a version of reality that reinforces their position of power and justifies their actions. By providing this open data with their own interpretation of the facts, they are quelling the desire of the public to uncover more. Their version of the truth is more powerful to them than their silence. So, now that I've analyzed this data and discussed how the framing of the officer-involved shootings diminishes the responsibility of the police officers involved, frames all of the victims of the shooting as bad guys, and leaves out important details of the case that undermine or put the police in a bad light, what's to be done? Well, in November of 2020, the people of Portland overwhelmingly voted for a new oversight board to replace the one I'm on, one with more teeth and the ability to discipline and even fire police. The police union tried to block it, but were overruled. I will be making a recommendation to the committee that is currently creating the new board that perhaps they should also take on the responsibility to edit and maintain a database of police officer shootings that can interpret the data from a different perspective, one that aims to dismantle the power structure of the police. If that's not possible, I will be working with Portland Cop Watch, which is an activist group focused on holding the police accountable. I would recommend that we follow the actions of Curry et al. In their 2016 study, where they brought their local community in Los Angeles together to derive new meaning from the open police data in a hackathon. This analysis has shown that the officer-involved shooting database is created in a way that upholds the power structure of the police in a subtle way that may go unnoticed by the general public, lulling them into the sense that they are getting the facts. I hope that this can be the start of a conversation with the public to create something new with the data that holds the police more accountable for their actions. This study was limited in the size of my narrative analysis and could possibly be strengthened through the use of corpus tools to analyze the database in its entirety. Additionally, more deep dive analyses could be done of individual cases by comparing the police narratives with other published information about the cases that include diverse perspectives. And finally, I just want to give a shout out to Dr. Conrad for her guidance and for generally being an awesome professor. I hope you have an amazing time in Bend. Thank you.